Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. I'm sorry for getting started a little bit late. My name is Eva Amelga, and I serve as the Director of Equity and Member Services at the National School Boards Association. I want to thank the Vermont School Boards Association and the Vermont Superintendents Association for the opportunity to present to you this session, Back to Governing, Identifying and Dismantling Institutional Racism in Education. I hope you find this information useful as you continue your work on behalf of the students of Vermont.
So, hi everyone. My name is Chelsea Myers. I'm the Associate Executive Director at the Vermont Superintendents Association. I will be monitoring this session. Please continue to ask questions in the question box. Questions will be moderated and asked at the end of the session. We are pleased to welcome Leah Amelga to our conference to talk about the critical topic of dismantling institutional racism in Back to Governing, Identifying and Dismantling Institutional Racism in Education. Leah is an education professional who is passionate about addressing issues that affect children and young adults regardless of their race, religion, nationality, ability, geography, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, or any aspect of their identity. As the Director of Equity and Member Services at the National School Boards Association, Leah supports and facilitates the work of the 4 equity councils and manages NSBA's equity-centered educational programming. She also provides board development on matters of educational equity. Prior to joining NSBA, Leah served as the Associate Director of K-12 Reform at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, supporting the Foundation's work on several policy areas, but primarily on school accountability under the Every Student Succeeds Act. As the Special Assistant to the Board of School Commissioners for Baltimore City Public Schools, Leah was responsible for drafting and maintaining district policies and overseeing appeals and ethics complaints to the board. As the daughter of 2 Ethiopians who immigrated to the United States for better educational opportunities, Leah was raised with an emphasis on the value of a high-quality education, which drives her work in striving to ensure that every student has equitable access to the quality educational opportunities that they deserve. Please join me in virtually welcoming Leah, and thank you again, Leah, for being here with us.
Thank you so much for the introduction. And again, I'm Leah Amelga. I'm glad to be here. And so, let's dive right in. So during this session, we will explore answers to the following questions. How do we define racism in its different forms? What does anti-racism look like in the context of education? What actions can boards take? How can success be measured? How do boards ensure positive changes are enduring? And what is the specific role school boards can and must fulfill to provide their students with access to engaging and rigorous educational opportunities regardless of their race, where they come from, and how they show up. We'll do this by learning helpful norms to have in place for race and equity discussions, gaining an understanding of how to identify racism, the range of inequities through the context of national and Vermont data, exploring the framework for dismantling institutional racism in education and the main drivers of educational equity, and developing an understanding of the school board's role in practicing equity. So for those of you who were able to join Virginia's session, these norms should look familiar to you, and this is just a testament to we practice what we preach, and we always try to start these conversations with norms for equity discussions. Talking about race is hard. Some might even say it's the Everest of conversations, which is why we like to start with norms up front. This is a list that's adapted from Glenn Singleton's book, Courageous Conversations About Race, and we found them to be helpful in navigating many different types of complex discussions and recommend setting these or similar norms when taking these conversations back to your district. I encourage you to not only note these norms for the discussion you plan to have, for the discussions you plan to have in the future, but to practice them throughout today's session as well. So for those who were able to join, you've got a little bit of a teaser of what they are, but the first norm is to speak your truth in the virtual context. That means sending in your questions, sending in your comments, I'll be answering them at the end of the session. And staying engaged, expecting to experience discomfort at some level and persist anyway. You'll often hear us say that if you don't feel at least a little bit uncomfortable, then we're not doing our jobs, because that means we're pushing you to grow and just opportunity to learn. Be aware of your intent and own your impact. This is more of when you're having discussions with your colleagues and other people in your community. Sometimes we say things that we don't intend for them to be taken a certain way, but they are. And instead of focusing on the fact that that wasn't our intent, we focus on the fact that it still had a very real impact for the person who's sharing, that it had an impact, and moving forward with that as the central focus and trying to move forward with the conversation by acknowledging that. 2448. So on the other hand, if you're the person who heard something that you feel like impacts you negatively, we want to make sure to address it within 24 hours or let it go within 48. So again, in this virtual context, if there's anything I say that causes you to pause and you want to reflect on it some more, you want to share how it's impacted you, again, welcome to send that in the questions or the chat, or I'll be providing my contact information at the end, so feel free to email me or call me and let me know. So expect and accept non-closure. This is a 1-hour session, and so these conversations, like many other critical conversations, are usually not done, one and done. And so the expectation is that this is maybe not the beginning of the conversation, but a part of the conversation, and that any kind of enduring change, especially when we're talking about dismantling years and years and years of practice and ideology, requires time to get through it. So, and then finally, ask you to maintain a learner stance and remain open to new thinking. For some of you, you may have been doing this work for years and years and years, and this might be a refresher. It might be confirmation of the work you're doing. It might be, and for others, it might be completely new to you, or something you've heard a little bit about, but didn't quite get what that means and how that plays out and affects you directly. So again, just asking you to keep an open mind and present any questions that you may have that hopefully we can address within this period. So, and I just want to note, like the two norms that are bolded are the ones that are the most difficult for people to practice usually. And so if you're finding difficulty practicing them, you're not alone. Practice makes perfect, and so we continue to strive to meet the expectations of these norms. So now that we've discussed how to navigate this conversation, let's jump right in and take a look at some of the key definitions that'll help us in our discussion. So to understand anti-racism and dismantling racism, we must first understand what racism is and its different forms. We have systemic racism, which is the ongoing racial inequities maintained by society; interpersonal racism, which includes the bigotry and biases shown between individuals through words and actions; internalized racism, which is the race-based beliefs and feelings within individuals; and the focus of today's presentation, institutional racism, which is also known as systemic racism, structural racism, which, according to Ontario's 3-year anti-racism plan, occurs when an institution or a set of institutions working together creates and maintains racial inequity. This can be unintentional and doesn't necessarily mean that people within the organization are racist. However, it is often caused by hidden institutional biases in policies, practices, and processes that privilege or disadvantage people based on race. It can be the result of doing things the way they've always been done without considering how they impact particular groups differently. The Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, adds that institutional racism is distinguished from the explicit attitudes or racial bias of individuals by the existence of systemic policies or laws and practices that provide differential access to goods, services, and opportunities of society based on race. Institutional racism results in data showing racial gaps across every system. For children and families, it affects where they live, the quality of the education they receive, their income, the types of food they have access to, their exposure to pollutants, whether they have access to clean air, clean water, and adequate medical treatment, and the types of interactions they have with the criminal justice system. So anti-racism is the ongoing practice of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes so that systemic racism is not perpetuated and power is redistributed and shared equitably. Anti-racism is about taking proactive steps to fight racial inequity. It's different from other approaches that focus on multiculturalism or diversity because it acknowledges that systemic racism exists and actively confronts the unequal power dynamic between groups and the structures that sustain it. Anti-racism involves consistently assessing structures, policies, and programs through monitoring outcomes and ensuring that they are fair and equitable for everyone. So in order to define equity, it is important to differentiate between equality and equity. This graphic is helpful in depicting the differences where equality is each person receiving the same amount of resources, attention, and support, while equity is each person receiving resources, attention, and support based on the amount they need. Educational equity is every student having access to the resources and educational rigor they need at the right moment in their education, despite race, gender, ethnicity, language, ability, family background, family income, and any other characteristic that is part of their identity. That being said, there isn't one exact definition for equity. Virginia shared earlier how the NSBA organization and the board define equity, and it's here for you to read, but in the interest of time, I will leave it here and know that some of you enjoyed hearing the details in the earlier session. But the key is that these definitions should be created within your community and within your district because it looks differently in each district, and really to have ownership over what equity means for your community, creating a shared language and a shared definition is a crucial step in the process. So while NSBA has increasingly invested in its commitment to educational equity, our leadership believed that it was necessary to create an initiative that explicitly focused on racial inequities in education, as school board members are being asked, school board associations are being asked by their members for support in addressing racism in their districts in the wake of the recent protests across the country. The Dismantling Institutional Racism in Education, DIRE, initiative acknowledges that institutional, structural, and systemic racism has been ingrained in the history of America and throughout its public education system. This initiative is dedicated to understanding and recognizing that root causes of barriers to equitable education outcomes for each child and is obliged to work to eliminate disproportionality in all aspects of public education. So where do school boards fit in? School boards play a crucial role in ensuring equity for each student and for dismantling institutional racism in their districts. The promise of public education is for every child to succeed in school and life. To realize this promise, every child must be given resources, supports, and interventions based on their needs. The nation's school boards are uniquely positioned to fulfill their promise to all students, which is why NSBA is committed to educational equity for all children in public schools. Board members must understand their role well and leverage their platform and authority to ensure that their work is equity-centered. The main function and role of school boards is to hire the superintendent, set policies, and approve their budget. They have the power to ensure equity by centering equity in their strategic plans through their mission, vision, and core values, and aligning their policies and budget to the goals of the plan. Hiring a superintendent that shares this vision by holding the superintendent accountable for faithfully executing the plan, engaging the community to ensure that they not only understand the plan but are involved in developing it, and advocating on behalf of the community to attain the necessary flexibility and funding to address their needs within and outside of schools. So before we continue with the framework for dismantling institutional racism in education, I'd like to pause and give us an opportunity to practice getting comfortable with being uncomfortable by addressing the elephant in the room. According to the 2019 National Assessment of Education Progress, 90.2% of students enrolled in Vermont schools are white, and data reported to the Office of Civil Rights informs us that 6.5% of school districts are 100% white, and 81.5% of Vermont school districts have populations that are at least 90% white. So you may be asking yourself, how does this conversation apply to my district? Or what does anti-racism mean in a majority or an all-white school district? Well, as educators, we want to prepare students for lives in a diverse world and preparing them to live and participate in an anti-racist society. Being anti-racist in education means recognizing that there are no neutral policies. Policies always have an impact. They either perpetuate inequitable outcomes or they intentionally seek to eradicate inequitable outcomes. It also means understanding intersectionality and the importance of addressing the other inequities that contribute to institutional racism. Intersectionality is a phrase that was first coined by law professor and social theorist Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. You might have seen a TED Talk she did recently where she talks about, knowing the names of the victims of police brutality and how majority of people knew the names for all the male victims, but not necessarily the female victims. And so in her framework, she conceptualizes that a person, a group of people, or social problem as affected by a number of discriminations and disadvantages. It takes into account people overlapping identities and experiences in order to understand and the complexity of prejudice they face. In other words, intersectionality theory asserts that people are often disadvantaged by multiple sources of oppression: their race, their class, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, and other identity markers. Intersectionality recognizes that identity markers, for example, being a woman and being Black, do not exist independently of each other, and that each informs the other, and often creating a complex convergence of oppression. In education, combating institutional racism also means combating poverty, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, xenophobia, and other prejudices that our students face. While the majority of Vermont students are white, heterosexual, and well-off, over 8,500 of your students are not white. Almost 4,000 of your high school students identify as LGBTQ or not sure, and more than 32,000 of your students are eligible for the National School Lunch Program. And this is out of about 88,000 students. Addressing the inequities facing these students is anti-racism work, and fortunately, the same framework we use for addressing racial inequities can be applied to addressing other inequities as well. So taking dire action means practicing equity by conducting a data walk to get to know your students well, who they are, where they're coming from, how do they show up, and intentionally analyzing your data for racial and other inequities in participation and performance. For example, academic achievement, to include assessments, honor roll, grades, graduation rates, earning college credits, and dual enrollment, IB and AP programs, magnet programs, and extracurriculars, for example, foreign language clubs, arts, music, theater, sports, robotics clubs, chess clubs, and many other clubs that students love to engage in. Identifying and analyzing the root causes of barriers to opportunities and resources is the I. R is revisiting and revising your policies and practices to enable access to the missing resources and opportunities. And finally, by evaluating your efforts by continuously monitoring and reviewing key indicators to measure progress and reassess the efficacy of your current plan and action. The remainder of the presentation will be focused on providing you tangible examples of how the framework it works and how it's designed and can be applied. So in order to understand the need for educational equity, we must dig into the key data points that tell us who our students are in Vermont and across the nation and how they're performing. Please note that in the interest of time, many important data points have been excluded from this data walk, and it's really just a sample. So while the white population today is still the majority overall, its share of the total population is 1/4 smaller than it was 50 years ago and getting more diverse, with Asians and Hispanics accounting for the largest growth. In fact, current estimates project that by 2060, the United States population will be majority-minority nation with whites in the plurality, followed by Hispanics. We already see this trend playing out in the nation's public schools. And so we see that the United States student population is becoming more and more diverse. In fact, approximately 0.4% of public school students identify as American Indian or Alaska Native, 3.2% identify as two or more races, 5.1% identify as Asian or Pacific Islander, 15.4% identify as Black, 27.6% identify as Latinx or Hispanic, and 46% identify as white, making the public school enrollment majority students of color. Now let's look at rural populations, and here's why. While poverty is often associated with urban areas, poverty in rural America actually exists at higher rates. It's felt at deeper levels, and it's more persistent than in metropolitan areas. Approximately 64% of rural counties have high rates of child poverty as compared to 47% of urban counties. More children in rural communities come from conditions of poverty than in the past, and today in 23 states, more than half of the rural student population come from a low-income family. This is up from 16 states just a few years ago. In Vermont, more than 70% of public schools are located in regions that are classified as rural. So as we saw in the previous slide, about one in every five children in the United States lives in poverty. In Vermont, that number is a little bit lower, which is good, but still tens of thousands of children may be facing the implications of living in poverty, meaning they are more likely to experience violence in their homes and neighborhoods, suffer malnutrition, psychological trauma, lack residential stability, and experience mobility-related interruptions in their academic year. So now that we have a glimpse into who our children are, let's talk about the achievement gaps that exist in the nation and in Vermont. So Education Week defines the achievement gap in education as the disparity in academic performance between groups of students. The achievement gap shows up in grades, standardized test scores, course selection, dropout rates, and college completion rates, among other success measures. It is most often used to describe the troubling performance gaps between Black and Hispanic students at the lower end of the performance scale and their non-Hispanic white peers, and the similar academic disparity between students from low-income families and those who are better off. And in the past decade or so, scholars and policymakers have begun to focus increasingly their attention on other achievement gaps, such as those based on sex, English language, proficiency, and learning abilities. And most recently, there's been an interest in identifying the gaps based on geography as well. So the National Assessment of Educational Progress, NAEP, is the only assessment that measures what U.S. students know and can do in various subjects across the nation, states, and in some urban districts. Also known as the nation's report card, NAEP has provided important information about how students are performing academically since 1969. 3 achievement levels for each grade exist. Basic denotes partial mastery of knowledge and skills that are fundamental for proficient work at a given grade. Proficient represents solid academic performance for the given grade level and competency over challenging subject matter, including subject matter knowledge application of such knowledge to real world situations and analytical skills appropriate to the subject matter. And advanced presumes mastery of both the basic and proficient levels and represents superior academic performance. So NAEP testing begins in the 3rd grade. The following charts and the data points are based on the 2019 NAEP scores in 4th and 8th grade reading and math. And so here you'll see the achievement gaps by race persist nationally in 4th grade reading. The higher the color block, the higher the performance. We see that approximately half of Black and Latinx and American Indian, Alaska Native students are performing below basic compared to their white, Asian, Pacific Islander, and students who identify as 2 or more races. Where they're about a quarter or less of them performing below basic. And we see similar trends in 8th grade math. And honestly, we typically don't see much divergence from these gaps at the state and district level, even across different assessments outside of NAEP. Achievement gaps in reading also persist nationwide based on family income. The average 4th grade student that is eligible for free and reduced price lunch or the National School Lunch Program has a NAEP score of 208, which is considered basic, while their counterparts who are not eligible for free and reduced price lunch have an average score of 236, which is considered proficient, or 235, excuse me. So, and we see a similar trend in 8th grade, except 256 is actually at the low end of proficient, but still proficient nonetheless. And this is a change from the 2017 data, which even though we see this major gap, the students who were eligible for free and reduced price lunch were performing at an average level that was considered basic. So how does Vermont stack up nationally? And you saw this chart a little bit earlier. We're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive since we have the time now. Vermont's percentage of students at or above proficient is significantly, and I mean like scientifically significantly, higher than the national average on 8th grade math and on 4th grade reading, which is commendable, well, on 8th grade math, and then which is commendable since that is not the case in several states. But let's take a closer look at achievement levels disaggregated by student population. So it's actually really difficult to find data on Vermont student achievement disaggregated only by race, and this is because data from NAEP and other assessments is not available disaggregated by race in Vermont due to the very few number of students who fall into each racial category, which creates privacy concerns. And basically, that means that if there aren't enough students, so if you looked at their scores, you technically would be able to identify who the students are, since there are so few of them, and there's a standard that's set by most of these assessments to make that a very difficult task. And so, fortunately, though, the Vermont Agency of Education, within your accountability system that you created for ESSA, for the Every Student Succeeds Act, they've created this new category of historically marginalized students and created as a reporting group, and it combines student groups including non-white racial ethnic groups, students with disabilities, English learners, and students in poverty, these groups that are generally too small to report separately. So here we see that achievement gaps exist in every grade level, and this is from the Smarter Balance Assessment of 2019. So although the data can't be disaggregated by race, it can be disaggregated in most cases by other student characteristics that were included in the historically marginalized group, including English language learners, students with disabilities, students who are eligible for the National School Lunch, and eligible for the National School lunch program. Vermont English language learners are significantly outperforming the nation's students in fourth grade reading by 14 percentage points. We also see Vermont students who are eligible for the National School Lunch Program are performing better in eighth grade math compared to the national average of students who are eligible for the school lunch program by 5%. So these successes should be celebrated, and we should also pay attention to the data that shows areas where Vermont students are falling behind the national average. For example, Vermont students with disabilities are 5 percentage points behind in performance in fourth grade reading compared to the nation's students with disabilities. So the most important takeaway from this slide, however, should be that no student population in Vermont or nationwide has more than half of their students that are at least proficient in either of these subjects, which means that on average, the majority of your students are not able to be considered masters of the basic components for reading and math on their grade level. So lastly, I want to point out that in the last slide, we saw the comparison between students who are eligible for the National School Lunch Program in Vermont and nationwide. But this chart shows the gaps between students who are eligible for the free and reduced price lunch or the National School Lunch Program and those who are not eligible. And this is a little bit of a different data point because you can see the gaps here are greater. You see similarly to the nation CUP scores, similar gaps, but if we look at the percentages, as we saw on the last slide, the percentage of students who are eligible for the National School Lunch Program were performing about 21% were proficient or above nationwide, and 22% were proficient or above in Vermont. But when you look at non-free and reduced price lunch performance nationwide, it's 51% are proficient or above, and that's just a huge, basically double, or more than double. So it's a huge gap, and this is just based on socioeconomic status. And so as a reminder, more than a third of Vermont students are eligible for free and reduced price lunch. So achievement gaps in reading, achievement gaps in math also exist, and you see a similar trend here. And just to give you those percentage points, free and reduced price lunch nationwide, 18% are performing proficient or above. In Vermont, that's 23%. And for non-free and reduced price lunch students nationwide, it's 48% are performing at proficient or above in eighth grade math. So these are some pretty sobering data points and cause us to ask what causes these achievement gaps. Well, achievement gaps result from opportunity and access gaps. So how do we identify inequities, and how do we identify these the root causes to these opportunity gaps? And I'm doing the two sections together again in the interest of time, but really these would be their own fleshed out sections, and you'll see how they're all interconnected, and you'll see how it kind of ties them together to give you the most amount of information. But really these are their own crucial steps, and Regina talked about the importance of looking at your history and doing root cause analyses about where did these policies come from, why were they created, who were they created to serve, and then when you're looking through each of these different sections, there's some very pointed and critical questions that school board should be asking, and we'll share some of those with you as part of the process. And let's define an opportunity gap before we get into that. So the opportunity gap is the greatest crisis facing America's schools. Students from historically disadvantaged families have just a 51% opportunity to learn when compared to white and non-Latino students, according to the Soft Foundation's Opportunity to Learn Index. If every child is to have an opportunity for success, every student must have the true opportunity to learn. And opportunity and access gaps can be based on family or school dynamics, and a lot of times we hear school districts or some school board members might say to us, well, I can't control what's happening at home. You see they might have poor nutrition at home, or they're not, they weren't fed and they show up hungry. And in the past, there was a time when school districts would say, well, if they showed up hungry, that's kind of out of our wheelhouse. We're here to teach reading and math. But as time has evolved and as really and as practicing equity, a lot of schools and a lot of school districts now either offer, universal breakfast, universal lunch, and we've seen through this pandemic and crisis that schools have continued to serve as a source for food for families, even though learning is happening digitally or virtually. And so it's key to understand that even though some of these opportunity gaps start at school, they don't need to be start at home. They don't need to be perpetuated at school. So overall, questions you should be asking yourself just in general. This comes from Portland Public Schools, and it's really just that school board members should have a clear and deliberate focus on equitable outcomes as they consider each of their policies, programs, practices, and decisions for which you're responsible. So these following 5 questions just generally are a beginning guide to things you should be thinking about. And again, we'll go into a deeper dive of what this looks like when we're talking about specific aspects of the school district environment. So questions are, who are the underrepresented groups affected by these policies, programs, practices, and what are the potential impacts on these groups? Does the policy, program, or practice decision worsen existing disparities or produce other unintended consequences? How have we intentionally involved stakeholders who are also members of the community and affected by these decisions? What are the barriers to more equitable outcomes? And how will you, A, mitigate the negative impact, and B, address the barriers identified above? And this is really the guiding framework and guiding questions for the work and practicing equity that contributes to dismantling institutional racism in your district. So there are several areas you can start. You want to do an equity analysis. There's so many topics and factors that contribute to the success of the students and supporting their needs that school boards are responsible for writing policies on and passing budgets on. And so, we encourage school districts to do equity analysis, but to start by focusing on the main drivers of equity that Virginia touched on a little bit earlier. And we'll go through and walk through what it means to do this kind of analysis in each of the categories. But I will, except for meaningful community engagement, because I'll say up front, really meaningful community engagement is kind of throughout each of these processes. It's to make sure that you are involving the community, like one, knowing who the community is, that's a big part of it, but involving the community and making sure that there aren't any barriers to access for them. A lot of times school boards talk about, what time are you having your board meetings? Is it in the middle of the day when people are working? Is it around dinner time? Are you providing food? Are you providing childcare? Are you providing translators? And depending on your community, those needs might be different. What languages are you translating and which ones aren't you? So that's when we talk about really knowing your community. And sometimes people get, I mean, frustrated is a strong word, but they're like, this is nice and this is helpful, but it doesn't really get into like, I just want an answer. What is the one right way to do this? What's the silver bullet? Come on, tell me, Leah. And the thing is because it's based on need, and that's why I would say, it's not about equality, it's about equity. It's really specific and customized to who your students are, who the families are that support them, and what they need. And you have to involve the community in order to know that, because you might represent one part of the community, but not the entire community. And so really meaningful community engagement is a very, very, very crucial part of doing this work. So that being said, money is probably the clearest indicator of educational equity between districts. Typically, the largest share of school revenue comes from the state and local dollars, and sometimes you'll see that if you combine them, about 90% of the total budget. As Virginia touched on earlier, and as you guys know, because you live here and you work here in Vermont, that you are doing a great job providing funding to districts, and your per pupil expenditures are excellent and higher than the national average, thanks to the Act 60 model, which we really think is an exemplar approach to equitable funding distribution for districts. And that being said, that leads us to ask, well, once all that money comes to the district, what are you doing with it? How are you allocating it? And is it based on the needs, again, of your community? How do you ensure that you're intentionally allocating resources to your schools? Well, here are a couple of questions that you can ask yourself to ensure that you're allocating funding equitably to your schools. So where you put the resources, do they bring the most value for student outcomes? What if this requires redistributing funds where it's most needed? And how will the board know that this allocation will produce the desired impact? And those are questions to ask yourselves and have a conversation with your governance team, which includes your superintendent and their staff, and really have a discussion about this as you're planning your budget each year. It's a critical piece of the conversation. Curriculum, can you agree and your school board agree and your governance team agree that all children have the right to an academically rigorous education that prepares them for college and career? And until every child has equal access to that rigorous and relevant and rich curriculum, that the quality of instruction in schools will remain one of the key issues to attaining educational equity for all. So the data point I'm going to use is really just showing how are your students performing in core and non-core ACT subjects. So do your students have access to the rigorous coursework that prepare them for college and career? This is one benchmark, and I know it's not perfect, but it's one that helps us kind of show and disaggregate by race some of the inequities that exist. And we see here that the Black students are the furthest behind in performance for both core and non-core subjects. And while we see differing levels of performance for the other racial groups, either amongst each other or depending on whether it's a core subject or not, it just kind of helps us identify so many areas where you can kind of dig a little deeper. And I love charts like this because, you can start really seeing that the supports that these students need are probably not going to be the same because there are different levels of gaps and different levels of achievement. And so, you start asking yourself, well, what could be the root cause? What could be going on in these communities? What other factors can we look at that we know, based on research, impact students' achievement on the ACT or whatever other assessment it is, whatever other indicator it is that you're looking at. So some of the critical questions to ask, right? So to start this analysis and ensure that students have equitable access to high-level curriculum, local school boards need to answer the following questions. How can we guarantee high-quality curriculum in all schools? How can we offer AP, IB, Cambridge courses that are openly accessible to all? How can we provide extra support to students who need it? And how can we ensure students have access to engaging work-based learning opportunities? And I throw that in because, there's a lot of conversation in the last few years, especially with ESSA and the ESSA indicators, talking about, how do we measure students' preparedness for career? I mean, we look at different assessments for college, but a lot of businesses are telling us that students don't have the soft skills necessary, the life-ready skills that they need in order to do well in their careers. And so having these engaging work-based learning opportunities helps them grow these soft skills, social emotional skills, the many names that they come up under, but it really does provide an opportunity. And thinking, one of the key things, I always ask is, well, are there any paid opportunities? So when we looked at the gaps for students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch, a lot of times, especially if they're in high school or later in high school, junior and seniors, they're driving, they're working, some might be helping support their families, some might be just supporting themselves to do the other extracurricular activities that they want to do. So, if we're looking at an internship that's not paid, a lot of times they have to make a decision about, should I spend my time working at some job that's not going to give me the course credits? I'd love to do this other internship, but I need the financial support. So there are a lot of programs, or some programs across the nation, that actually partner with businesses to create paid internship opportunities for students. So that's like one area to look at. And once you start diving into the issues, you see that there are people who've been working on some of the solutions, but until you get a chance to sit down and focus on it, it's really, it's not going to be addressed. And so just encourage you to ask these questions and follow up with them and work in your governance teams to start addressing specifically how it impacts your students in your community. So effective educators, teachers have a huge influence on student performance. They also are sometimes they're the ones who are identifying students as, gifted and talented or into certain programs, and they're also identifying students as special needs or needing special education. And so a lot of teachers' role plays into this. And then we want to ask ourselves, well, how many times do students see themselves in their teachers? How well do teachers know their students? And we see gaps here as well, which I think is unsurprising. This is an issue in the majority of districts that we work in. But in Vermont specifically, while 10.4% of your students identify as, American Indian, Alaska Native, Asian, Black, Latinx, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, only 2.9% of teachers identify as one of these categories, compared to 89.6% of your students who identify as white and 97.1% of those teachers who also identify as white. So in addition to being less likely to be taught by a teacher that identifies as the same race, students of color who attend schools that are Title I schools are more likely to be taught by an uncertified teacher, and Regina touched on this on her keynote as well. But the percentage of uncertified teachers in public schools has been steadily declining, but we still see inequity, even though there are fewer uncertified teachers. So, it's something to really be cautious of, and speaks to how much time and continuous effort and continuous ongoing assessment it requires to ensure that we're seeing equitable allocation of resources. And people don't like when I call teachers resources, but they are, and so equitably allocating teacher assignments, and then how they then support their students, and we end up seeing better outcomes for them. So, when analyzing the opportunity gaps based on your educator effectiveness, boards should ask the following questions. What supports are needed to ensure teacher effectiveness? What does teacher evaluation look like in your district? What policies or contract discussions need to happen to ensure positive outcomes for students? And what are innovative strategies that districts can replicate? And the fourth driver of equity is safe and supportive schools. We have a safe and supportive school, a Center for Safe and Supportive Schools at NSBA that focuses in on these four factors: infrastructure, crisis and emergency management, whole child health, and cybersecurity. And under whole child health, that encompasses so many of the critical other factors kind of happening outside the classroom and inside of the classroom that aren't directly linked to, that aren't considered academic, but are directly linked to academic performance, kind of how those play out and how schools and school boards can show up for students in in those areas. So we talked a little about student discipline. Virginia mentioned the Vermont Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and I'll just quickly read through some of the findings that they shared in their report. Vermont has disparities in school discipline. They reviewed the kicked out report that was done in 2015 by Mr. Diaz from, and I think it was from the, he's an attorney, and I don't want to say it's the public defenders, but he did this report, and they basically found similar findings. And the report from this commission came out in December 2019, so it's pretty recent information. The second finding was there's no long-term or plan for addressing implicit bias in the state. The zero tolerance policies are still being utilized in districts across Vermont. There is inadequate data collection and dissemination across Vermont, which you've heard me already allude to several times by not being able to find some of the disaggregated academic data that I would typically like to share in these sessions, but that are really useful for school districts in making your decisions and when you're reviewing your policies. Students, the fifth finding is students are being informally excluded from school, which is a huge issue, and there is insufficient training regarding cultural competency and emotional disturbance. So this alone could be its own session, but in the interest of time and wanting to make sure I get to some of your questions, I'm going to quickly read some of the recommendations and get an opportunity to see if there are any questions for me. So recommendations were institute equity inclusion data reports. Burlington School District actually does this, and they mentioned it in the report. I got a chance to look at it, and it's a really great way to start looking at some of the key indicators that are relevant in making decisions about students' education. Adopt restorative justice programs. Although it seems like a lot of districts have adopted some version of a restorative justice program, I think they're speaking more to the implementation and making sure that it's a central and key strategy for student discipline. Hire equity instruction leaders and create initiatives for inclusion and the use of seclusion and restraint techniques. Improve communication with and involvement of families in disciplinary processes. And I, again, could say so much about that, but, encourage the implementation of long-term training initiatives and zero tolerance for zero tolerance policies, which I like that play on words, but it's key because, again, one size doesn't fit all, and understanding the circumstances that lead to students' behavior is critical in making sure that you are, and schools are implementing the correct behavioral support so that the behavior doesn't show up again and not necessarily to be punitive and exclude them from an instructional time. Improve access to comprehensive and complete data, and the practice of informal exclusion. Require classroom management and special education courses for teachers. And so, I think these are all great recommendations. These cute little kids seem to agree with me, and would definitely encourage you to take a closer look at that report and see where your school district may have opportunities to improve student discipline practices. And these are some of the key questions to be asking. Is there a disparate impact? What are the offenses that students are being suspended or expelled for? Are they objective or are they subjective? Being, objective, smoking in the bathroom, bringing a firearm. Subjective, talking back, insubordination, and just kind of looking at what are the discipline offenses that students are being suspended for. Address school culture, prevent conflict, and grow relationships. So, and quickly, accountability is key for enduring change. You ensure that decisions are data-driven. If you're using data to identify the problem, you should use similar or the same data to see if you're fixing the problem. Ask the right questions. We've given you plenty of questions to get you started, but I'm sure you'll have many more about how you can make sure that when you see positive changes, that you're continuing that trend. And then if you put in a new policy and you're not seeing the changes you expected, reassessing and keeping that will to continue reassessing. And then following through with your goals and your strategic plan. You might feel like you've made a lot of changes, that you've learned a lot, that you've done all these trainings, and you're doing things so differently than you have in the past. And you might be telling yourself that, in your strategic plan, are you really going to have 100% of students are reading on grade level, and all student and universal lunch, universal breakfast, universal hearing and vision testing, everyone's graduating, and everyone has all the supports they need. And, you might be saying to me, well, we don't have the budget, we don't have the staff, we don't have the space, and most crucially, we don't have the political will. And honestly, it's really, is it our responsibility as school board members to do all of these things? It's impossible. And we would respond and say, we recognize it's daunting, it's difficult, it's quite a tall order, and will require a lot of sacrifice. However, these truths don't absolve us of working towards achieving these goals, because children need them, and you have the power to deliver them. So one of my favorite quotes from Nelson Mandela is, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And I read somewhere, someone added on, and then it seems inevitable. And so we encourage you to help us get to the stage where we can look back and say that implementing these services for students and this high quality education for students was inevitable, instead of saying that it's impossible. And so looking forward, these are some of the things to take back, and how you feel about what you've learned today, and how can you take this back to your district and start implementing it, questions for you to chew on. So I really want to thank Vermont School Superintendent Association, Vermont School Board Association, for having me here, and they're here to support you in this work, as well as NSBA working through the Vermont School Board Association to help you in any way we can to serve students. So here's my contact information as promised, and I know I'm a little bit over time. I have time, but to answer any questions that might be out there. But also happy to send a follow-up answering any questions that we don't get to in writing.
And I was on mute. Thank you so much, Leah. We really appreciate it. We do have a couple of questions, so we're going to stay on if that's okay and answer them. And then if we get more, we'll answer those at a later date. So the first question we have is, can you give us an example of a school board's community engagement that you would recommend? We hear this phrase and discuss it a lot, have done board training on community engagement, and still we have strong disagreements about what it should look like.
Sure. So I'll say when I worked in Baltimore City, we get a lot of feedback from the community that they were involved in the process too late. So we would come to them and say, hey, these are the changes to the policy. Do you have any public comments? And that's usually how a lot of people operate too. It's like, we've made all these changes, lawyers have looked at it, the advocates have looked at it, some of the advocates that they haven't in, and the school board and superintendent have looked at it, but the community hasn't gotten the opportunity to, at the forefront, talk about what matters most to them on this specific topic. So then we're saying you have 2 weeks between these two board meetings, give us public comment, and the reality is that's not enough time, especially unless it's something egregious. You have enough time to consider it and say, hey, maybe we do want to make this change. What ends up happening is at the school board meeting where they vote on it, some important key things are brought up, and we might implement it next time we review the policy a year, 2 years from now. But it's kind of a missed opportunity. So one of the things I would say is what we started implementing is once the initial policy is drafted, before it's ever seen by the board, we take it to the community. And so they're able to give input and on the front end and say, hey, you guys are proposing these changes. Why? What is this about? This is what my recommendations are. This doesn't address X, Y, and Z. And so, one, it just gives them a lot more time to digest the change that's happening. So instead of hearing about it 2 weeks before the board votes on it on the prior board meeting, they would hear about it 3 months before the board votes on it, because that's when we start the internal process of making changes. that was fairly successful. We would go to the parent community advisory board, and so people would come there, but we would also sometimes go to schools. We would send it out through the unions and send it out to schools. So people had the opportunity to give public comment, and honestly, it gave us time to go through the public comment and incorporate some of the changes. And some people, don't feel comfortable submitting their suggestions in writing, either because of the strength of their, writing ability or just confidence about it. So having the opportunity to talk face-to-face and ask questions was always really, really critical. The other thing is, again, considering where you're doing it, how you're doing it, how accessible are you? Sometimes we have committee meetings at noon. Most people can't make it at noon. That's just the reality. And so the school board really has to think about that and figure out a way to relay that information to the community, either after or before, or live streaming it using technology. And, during this time, COVID, we've seen that there's a lot of things that people in the past would have been hesitant to use technology to have a conference, to have a meeting, but we see that people can do it and access it. And if you can go to people's phones, then you're good, because almost everyone has a phone, even if they don't necessarily have a laptop or Wi-Fi at their house.
Thank you. We have, how do we dismantle racism in our schools if we're not teaching about it? What are things that we can do today?
Sure. So, your students know about it. It's on social media. It's been discussed. How they feel about it is, another thing. But really having a conversation. Again, this goes back to your community. What do you want to address? What is your history? It seems so amorphous when you talk about racism in the nation and what's going on, and sometimes it makes it easier to say, well, that's not us. We're not an urban district. We only have white students. We're in the north. Whatever it is, people always have an opportunity to say, well, it doesn't apply to us, so we don't have to talk about it. But the reality is that, we learn history of, what happened in the Alamo, Louisiana Purchase, the California Gold Rush, regardless of where you are in the nation. And so it comes back to intentionality. So you talk to your community and realize we want to be an anti-racist society. We want to be an anti-racist school district. And we know that being anti-racist also means addressing these other inequities that do exist or may exist in our district. Then it is a part of the conversation. It is a part of the history lessons in the curriculum. And again, the board has a lot of influence there. Now, like I said, there's not one answer to that. That looks different from community to community, but that's a critical conversation that you should be raising with your fellow board members, or if you're not a board member, you should be raising to your school board and pushing them to look at it. And to be honest, I don't know if every district does elected school boards, but this is part of, when you start having these conversations, this is when school board members start putting this as part of your platform, and thinking about and pushing the conversation. So advocacy is a critical part of your role as a engaged member of the school community or the district community. And so if you think something is important too, that's something to advocate for and push school boards on. But I agree with you that it's critically important to encourage school boards to start doing some of this work themselves.
Can you repeat the Nelson Mandela quote that you gave?
Yes. The quote was, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And then, I don't know who the second part is attributed to, but I read somewhere someone said, yeah, it always seems impossible until it's done, and then it seems inevitable. And we've seen this a lot. I always look back and think, how did people get through civil rights movement, slavery? Like, how do you even see a world where slavery doesn't exist? Because it seems unfathomable. Honestly, if you were in that time, the power structures, the lack of power for people, the abolitionist movement initially, and then now looking back, it's like, well, of course, that system wasn't going to last forever. And I think there's a lot of times while you're in it, it seems impossible until you do it. And then it's like, well, of course we were going to figure that out. That's the same thing when technology is the best example. You used to watch the Jetsons and people would be like, I'm not doing video conferencing. And look at us now. It's like, well, of course we're going to get to video conferencing eventually. And so just kind of keeping that in mind, and like a little glimmer of hope that even when it seems impossible, where there's a will, there's a way, and definitely keeping that in the back of your mind and pushing to kind of find the solution to get to the goals that you're looking to achieve.
So how do we reframe the sentiment of all lives matter?
Sure. I mean, well, one of the things we talk about in our work is we don't say all for the most part. We try to say each and every, because a lot of times what happens is all becomes most, and in most, people that usually need the most support are not addressed. They're kind of lost in the shuffle. And so because there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach for education, then we have to look at each. And I think the same thing applies to when we're talking about all lives matter. Is I like to say, well, all lives should matter, which means Black lives should matter, but we've seen evidence that there are moments in time when they don't. And so it's important to call that out specifically, because that is the concern. Because and people like to say, until Black lives matter, all lives don't matter. But I think what happens is, and that if you believe all lives matter, then you believe Black lives matter, because I don't see how they're able to be separated. And if you don't have a problem with Blue lives matter, and you don't have a problem with all lives matter, but you do have a problem with Black lives matter, then that might require you to take a step back and think about why that is and why it makes you uncomfortable to say Black lives matter if you believe all lives matter.
How do we work with school board members that may exhibit behaviors of racism?
Sure. Well, accountability is not just the school board to the superintendent. Accountability is also amongst your colleagues. You are, I'm not going to say you have an obligation to say something, but I think, a lot of times people don't change until they're challenged to change, and some people just don't change. We like to work with a coalition of the willing whenever possible. Part of my role and my job is to talk to people and have conversations. A lot of times, when you're seeing people who have racist ideologies or enforce discriminatory practices or prejudice against people, it's usually more deep-rooted than whatever you're seeing at the surface. I'm not going to say the onus is on you to say something, because I don't know if that's a fair response. But I will say, a lot of times when you get into conversations with people who say something racist or who hold racist ideologies, either one, they don't view it that way. They don't view it as racist. And it might be, there's some other factors, always an explanation for, well, it's not, I don't hate these people, it's just, it is what it is, or this is the truth, or, and some people might be like, yeah, I don't like these people. Having one-on-one conversations, getting to the root cause, that requires a lot of patience and a lot of kind of being able to be a little more objective when you're having conversation with someone and not taking it personally. I know for me, at least, not taking some of the things they say personally, because if the goal is to come to an understanding, then I have to be willing to understand where your perspective is coming from before I can then ask you to be willing to understand where my perspective is coming from. Sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. And usually throughout the conversation, there are some points that you can find some agreement on, and trying to build around that, and trying to build around, using that as an analogy. We were out in a rural district and talking to a school board member, and he's like, oh, this equity stuff is fine, but like, I don't really see how this applies to me. Like, sometimes it's, it's just these kids. And I was like, well, different people have different cultures and different things that are normal to them. If you have kids out on farms who are driving when they're 14 years old, you think that's normal. In other states, they say that's against the law. And, you know, people just don't understand, like, that kids might be mature enough to do that. And he was like, oh, I see what you're saying, like how people, like, just, there's a lot of judgments and things that happen to each person. You can come up with stereotypes for every single kind of person. And if you don't want to be judged by the stereotypes that exist for your race, your gender, your, you know, your parents or grandparents, nation, nationality, ethnicity, then I think kind of helping people settle into that and say, like, oh, yeah, I'm not like blah, blah, blah that everyone says, the stereotype, then maybe these people, other people aren't either, because we're all individuals. And, you know, that's a long conversation. It takes a lot of will and a lot of effort and a lot of patience to have it. Sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not, but it's definitely worth attempting it if you have the heart and the mind and the focus for it. Oh, you might be muted.
Muted myself again, sorry. Well, thank you so much, Leah. We do have a couple more questions, but I'm going to encourage folks to send you an email. I think you put your email out on the last slide, so I also will send that out with materials following the conference. So if people still have questions for Leah, please feel free to reach out to her. We're going to end the session. And again, thank you so much on behalf of the Vermont Superintendents Association and the Vermont School Boards Association. We've really enjoyed having you here with us.
Thank you guys so much. Have a good one.